Hi, everybody. I'm so pleased to welcome you to this celebration of Jeremy Dauber's truly impressive and monumental accomplishment. It is always wonderful to celebrate a colleague's new book, but especially like such a hefty one. So I'm here to moderate this event. I will be introducing our speakers, so the author, and then our two speakers for the evening. Each person will give a brief presentation. Jeremy is going to tell us about his book, and then we'll have responses from our speakers. And I think he'll then have a short response, and then there will be plenty of time for discussion. So I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A if you have things that you want to ask our author or our panelists. So the man of the hour is Jeremy Dauber, who is the Atran Professor of Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture and Director of Columbia's Institute of Israel and Jewish Studies. He's the author of Antonio's Devils, Writers of the Jewish Enlightenment, and the Birth of Modern Hebrew and Yiddish Literature, In the Demon's Bedroom, Yiddish Literature and the Early Modern, The Worlds of Sholem Aleichem, and Jewish Comedy. His research interests include Yiddish literature, comparative Jewish literature, the Yiddish theater, American Jewish literature and popular culture, and American literature and popular culture. We'll then have two responses, and I should say for those who have seen the names on the program, unfortunately, Victor Laval at the last minute was prevented from joining us. So we'll be hearing tonight first from Tanir Oxman, who is a writer, teacher, and scholar. She's Associate Professor of Academic Writing at Marymount Manhattan College, where she teaches classes in writing, literature and comics, and journalism. Her interests revolve around comics and visual narrative, contemporary feminist literature, and memoir studies, as well as 20th and 21st century Jewish American literature and culture. She is the author of How Come Boys Get to Keep Their Noses? Women and Jewish American Identity in Contemporary Graphic Memoirs. Mariana Hirsch will be our second respondent, and she is William Peterfield Trent Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia and Professor in the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality. Her work combines feminist theory with memory studies, particularly the transmission of memories of violence across generations. Her recent books include School Photos in Liquid Time, Reframing Difference, which was co-authored with Leo Spitzer, and the co-edited volumes, Imagining Everyday Life, Engagements with Vernacular Photography, and Women Mobilizing Memory. And now we'll turn things over to Jeremy.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for chairing this and for these introductions. I'm so honored and grateful to have this celebration, and I want to thank, of course, the Heyman Center and Kay and Lindsay there. I certainly want to thank all of the people who co-sponsored this, and not least at all, my colleagues and panelists and fellow scholars here, Tanir and Mariana, whose work really was very important to me and who appear somewhere in that book, that both of them, and I am just so grateful that they've taken the time to join us all here tonight. This book, I just, as Rachel said, I'd like to just briefly introduce it, sort of and make a couple of quick points about this, about the book, and some of the interesting things that sort of I went through while sort of writing it. This book really is a Columbia project in two, I think, very fundamental ways, which also earn debts of gratitude. The first is that, like maybe a good number of the books that we write, that we all write, it was developed in part out of the thinking that I did in teaching a class on the subject here. And I've been teaching with my co-teacher, Paul Levitz, a class on the mostly on the American graphic novel for about 10 years. It was the byplay between Paul and myself and thinking about what we were both going to say, what I was going to say, and with all of the student responses that really sort of helped to kind of formulate some of the particular readings and the thoughts that came out of the book. And so I'm really grateful to all the students and of course to Paul. The making of this book, like all books, also involved reading a lot of books, both of the comic variety and the scholarship variety. And I am blessed for this to be a Columbia project in this way as well, that we have a remarkable sort of Columbia comics collection at the libraries. And this is thanks almost entirely to the work of Karen Green. And who I could not have done this without. So and all of the people at the library, many of whom I thank in the acknowledgments, who did not yell at me when I showed up with stacks and stacks of the books like the ones you see behind me on this table to sort of read through a lot of the material for the book. And I guess, in the process of writing the book and in teaching the class, one of the things that very frequently happened that I realized growing up as a superhero loving kid who then found Mouse and then who found a lot of it, was that very frequently when you have people in our fields talk about comics, they really talk about one particular branch of comics or another. Very frequently they're superhero people, they're sort of mainstream corporate comics people, or they're, let's call them, independent, alternative, graphic novel. There are lots of different names. And very rarely does the twain meet in the scholarship. Not never, of course, but not as often as maybe we would like. And in writing this book, I wanted to try and tell a story that kind of brought everything together as part of one larger tapestry. And part of the reason for that was that very many of the people I found, and doing my research for the class, who were the creators of a lot of this stuff, were very, you should excuse the expression from a professor who does a lot with Jewish studies, but they were very Catholic in their tastes. They really did enjoy reading and were inspired, maybe sometimes at different points in their lives, but by a wide variety of this material. And so I felt like maybe there was a way of trying to put my arms around a lot of that material and make it part of one kind of larger story. And so that was part of the impetus in trying to tell that story, and going back into sort of ways to maybe places where certain histories of comics might not have started, and really going back to the late 19th century and what have you, excuse me. And so what that also did, and as it does whenever any of us write our cultural histories, was to try, and I thought this was a lot of fun in writing sort of something that was a much larger historical project than anything I'd done before, was to try and put the veil of ignorance over myself and kind of write the book chronologically, thinking from the perspective of all of the players at that particular moment. They don't know what's going to happen kind of ahead of them. And so the example I often give when I talk about this is that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, the creators of Superman, they don't know, that this is going to be an iconic property that's going to make billions and billions of dollars. They don't know this at all. They see a product, right, that they've been trying to sell to the high status newspaper strip world that's been rejected everywhere. And so they decide, well, what can they do but try and sell it to this sort of schlocky comic book operation. And this doesn't excuse the kind of capitalist predatory behavior, let's say, of some of the people involved on the business end, but it explains the reason why they were willing to jump at this kind of decision, because of course they don't know what's going to happen next, and they are where they are. And it was fun to kind of, at every given moment of this story, try and see only what they were where they were. Obviously, we can't do that precisely, but that was sort of an interesting thing that came out. I thought also that it was very interesting for me to discover all sorts of works and ideas by looking at the scholarship of people like Tanir and Mariana and many others of things that I'd never even heard of before. And that was another way of also thinking about much of the material that had been marginalized both by processes of general sort of historical and social and sociological sort of phenomena, materials that, let's say, had been written by women or appeared in, let's say, black syndicates, black-owned newspapers, things like that, or also simply had not, for reasons of we focus on one thing or another, they just simply had fallen out of the critical discourse. And obviously, my researches were shaped by that kind of conversation as well. You can only know what you know. But there was something about saying, I'm going to read, God help me, all of the material that was published in the countercultural and underground era that appears in the Alexander Street database, regardless of just because it's there, and then see what comes up. And you find things that very rarely were not mentioned, right? Just because, and you know, this is my history. Someone else would have found other things that were interesting and sort of churning through that database. I'm very aware of that, but what can't escape one's own subjectivity ultimately, and one does what one can. The final point that I want to make, because you know, I really want to hear what Tanir and Mariana have to say, and we can open this in a conversation that really was very interesting to me as a result, I think, of 10 years of teaching with Paul, was a real emphasis on the institutional and the business side and the contingency sides of this, that this really was a story of those kinds of decisions that were being made as well. It would be very useful, for example, and very, in some cases, humbling to be in a class and start talking about Watchmen, for example, and have Paul standing next to me saying, well, you know, I was in the room when we made this decision, and that's actually not why we did it. We did it because we needed 3 pages to fill, and thus and such was going on. And that kind of voice in the back of the head of saying, really, isn't this a conversation about keeping printing presses running? Isn't this a conversation about paper quality? Isn't this a conversation about what kinds of inks the paper are going to hold? Those are the kinds of things that very frequently in certain kinds of writing that I would often do, you know, in sort of literary analysis, I didn't think about as much. But in writing this kind of cultural history, it became very interesting and important for me to do that. And so much of the story of the development of, let's call it sort of the graphic novel, right, is really about sort of looking at kind of corporate arrangements, business decisions, and things like that, that increasingly became, I don't want to say a preoccupation, but certainly a central part of the kind of story that I wanted to tell. But overall, I was just, and Rachel was very kind about sort of talking about the scope of the book, but I was overall just overwhelmed by the sheer amount of treasures that were out there over the kind of 150 years that I studied. And you will be maybe unsurprised or maybe just shocked to learn that the original draft I handed into my editor was almost twice the size of the one that you see before me. There was just, yeah, Mariana's reaction, I don't know if you can see it, is correct. Yes, this, but there was just so much, and is so much, that's worth celebrating, entertaining, that's thought-provoking, that's interesting, that's problematic, that wanted to be discussed. And so I really, in some ways, hope that there are lots of people who will read this book. They can agree and disagree with part. I'm sure that there's lots to disagree with. There's a lot of, but that it will be, in many ways, certain kinds of little places to dip into to start further conversations and to start other kind of work. And we're kind of starting that in certain ways here tonight. So I'm really excited to start that conversation. And that's what I want to say. And I'm going to turn it over back to Rachel, I think. So thank you all for being here.
No, I think we're just going straight to.
We're going to go straight over. Okay. Tanir, then. Okay.
Hi, I am so excited to be here. And Jeremy, I love that you talked about the one larger tapestry, because that metaphor suits what I want to say very nicely. So I wrote my comments down because I have so much I wanted to say in a very short amount of time. When I was in graduate school, we'll say about a dozen years ago, and I had decided to study comics officially. My approach by necessity was a patchwork, right? So you could read lots of books, mostly trade books, a few academic books about the history of some particular aspect of comics. So I was looking at my shelf today. For example, there was Douglas Woke's Reading Comics, which was focused a little bit on the definition of comics, which lots of people were focused on at that time for a variety of reasons, and then commented on a list of a dozen or so mostly contemporary creators and their work. Mostly white, mostly men, and mostly authors of long form pieces. You will probably not be surprised about that. Another one, I picked another one off my shelf, Roger Sabine's Adult Comics, as the title promised, focused mainly on the child-adult divide, ultimately doing those kinds of close readings that Jeremy mentioned, emphasizing works aimed at adults only in Britain and the US. So there were also broad histories of the comic strip. There were anthologies of interviews with important creators, famously one with Spiegelman from University Press of Mississippi, Andrea Juno's incredible Dangerous Drawings. You could try to dig up John Lent's International Journal of Comics Art for essays, which has been published since 1999, only in print, by the way, still, and famously hard to obtain. So there, or in a special issue of a forward-thinking academic journal for some time, you could learn about some creator you'd never heard before, or a long-forgotten comic strip, or some aspect of comics theory, carefully, microscopically turned over. So all of this is to say, how much would I have given for a book stopper, a comprehensive history, a volume that brought together this larger tapestry, various threads in a single traceable but still complex narrative, like Jeremy's book. So I'm going to just describe the threads that were important to me, a little bit of echoing Jeremy, but maybe through a slightly different lens. And I want to also say that the chapters are highly readable. And one of my favorite aspects of this book, in addition to learning about comics, is the kind of the asides and parentheticals where you feel like the historian sort of nudging you or laughing along with you at some of the absurdities along the way. So in 10 chapters, we go from the rise of the comic strip in the late 1800s, comic weeklies like Puck, to digital comics and the Comixology platform, which you can subscribe to for $5.99 a month through Amazon, which is important. So what were the most compelling threads to me? Well, the most exciting and ambitious aspect of American comics for me is its synthesizing, both of the touchstones of comics history, but also what Jeremy was saying, the subjects often left out of official comic histories. So these are instead more often the subjects of what we might think of as whisper networks or blogs, Twitter threads, conversations behind comics convention scenes, or after drinks at an MLA comics forum gathering. I'll highlight mainly two threads, which the book steadfastly returns to chapter after chapter, even with so much other territory necessary to cover. So first is that authority issue, right? Questions of copyright, ownership, distribution, that old battle between creating things as you want to create them and then worrying about what more powerful people will want the work to look like or will do with that work once they have it. So we see this in battles over characters like the Yellow Kid, who simply got handed over to a new artist when its original creator, Richard Outcault, was acquired along with his paper. We see it most famously with, as Jeremy mentioned, Siegel and Shuster, creators of Superman, who had no rights to their creation, and were reminded late in the book that Shuster was eventually picked up as a vagrant in Central Park. That thread is not dropped. And then more recently, we see it with Alan Moore's comments about the rights to his medium-altering creation, Watchmen, via DC, of course, related to a change in who was in charge. So the second issue, very much related to the authority issue, is the issue of representation, which Jeremy also mentioned. So it's not just the racist and misogynistic content in so much of this history of comics. It's also the backdrop to the making of this content. And these belong to some of the most famous comics figures, and the book does not shy away from this, right? So these are figures and texts that have shaped comics as we know them, from early strip creators to visionaries like Will Eisner or cult figures like Robert Crumb. So what the book returns to again and again is the seemingly contradictory premise that a mode that could be such a powerful weapon for resisting the status quo, a mechanism for political and social satire, and this is largely because it's of its status as an art of condensation, can also be a means, a very effective means for spreading stereotypes, for collapsing context, and inciting hatred. So both of these things the book keeps showing us can be true at the same exact time. Now, the book, as again, Jeremy mentioned, it traces the story of various technologies, the printing press, paper, also film, television, radio, the digital realm. Some of these are circular. So there's radio in the early 20th century affecting comics, and then later comics and podcasts, right, affecting podcasting. So by way of questions, one question that lingered for me by the end of the book was where those digital technologies are leading us, particularly when it comes to artistic and formal exploration. So for example, does the digital mode, the comixology interface, which allows you to see a full page, does it discourage creative innovation? And are there ways in which the online realm is spurring creative content, like on Instagram, which by the way, also brings up authority issues, because now who owns those images, right? Another important thread that can be traced throughout the book, so the comics for kids versus adults binary that gets really complicated, even as its genealogy is explained. And this bodes the question, is the future of comics in further dissolving some of the strictures of this divide? So here I'm thinking about the ways in which Raina Telgemeier's Guts graphic novel, which as you point out was one of the most successful graphic novels in comics history. It was read and reviewed and adored by adults, including me, including Times reviewers, alongside younger generations. So are we maybe ready to find new ways to talk about audience, especially given how many best-selling comics seem already to break down that divide? So you could think about, for example, Gene Yang's work. And in an age where kids' everyday encounters on the street, at school, online, can be scarier than any classic EC horror comic. And those are gory. So what are the stakes of that conversation about age and comics today? How can we find a better way to talk about it, especially when books are being banned for ostensible inappropriateness? Of course, here I'm thinking about mouse. I have one direct question about image, and I actually found it very refreshing to read a history of comics without any images. I was thinking about how the problem of including images would have been overemphasizing certain aesthetics or themes. So I wonder, was that a case of authority problems, or was it a decision, and what was the decision behind that? What was the reasoning behind that decision? Okay, I'm going to end with a few words that Art Spiegelman once said, explaining his practice of filling the space of panels. It's a famous quote. I think one thing I really learned from my father, this is Spiegelman, was how to pack a suitcase. It was the one thing he wanted to make sure I understood, like how to use every available centimeter to get as much packed into a small space as possible. So this is a quote of Spiegelman talking about comics, but it reminded me of this book and how somehow it's all packed in here.
Thank you, Tenier. That was amazing. Thank you. I think Rachel, we go to Mariana now, right? And then I respond to both Tenier and Mariana together, right? Okay, great.
Thank you. And both of you, I'm already learning so much from this conversation, and I'm happy to try to contribute to it. So let me just say that when I was invited to participate in this conversation, I was so excited about Jeremy's book that I immediately said yes. I knew that I would learn a lot by reading this magisterial history, and I knew it was a history I really needed to know a lot about. But as I was reading the book, I came to realize that I'm just the wrongest person to comment on it. Surely for most of you on this Zoom, the artists, the comic strips, the underground figures, the superhero Jeremy carefully places in a broad historical context evoke moments of pleasure from your own reading lives. You're familiar with their adventures and their creators, and will benefit greatly from following their vicissitudes over time in Jeremy's book. For me, however, the landscape of American comics is a foreign country. You see, I grew up in communist Romania in a German-speaking Jewish family from the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. The only comics I encountered in my childhood were a few strips of Mickey Mouse in used books acquired at the flea markets we visited frequently, translated into German, and I just loved it and wanted to find more. And of course, and I'm going to share my screen because we do need some images here in this conversation, so as to show you what I did know, or what I do know, and that is the classics that were part of every German-speaking child's repertoire. Max und Moritz, Eine Bubengeschichte in 7 Streichen, a story of 7 boyish pranks, which was originally published in 1865 by Wilhelm Busch, who makes a brief appearance in American comics as an inspiration to William Randolph Hearst and an influence on the Katzenjammer kids and on Quick and Flupkey comics. I'm so sorry to confess, I really don't know. Jeremy does not mention the other German classics, Der Struwwelpeter, Slovenly Peter, a collection of 10 rhymed moral tales for children, originally published by Heinrich Hoffmann in 1845, widely considered a precursor to comic books in the ways that this book combines visual and verbal narratives. For a young child, these stories were genuinely terrifying, even more so because of their humor and appealing rhyme. Struwwelpeter refuses to wash and cut his hair and is vilified by everyone, and that's not so bad. But in another story, Paulinchen plays with a match and ends up burning to death. You see the little cat's crying over her ashes. And Konrad sucks his thumb, and which results in his having it cut off by a tailor with a giant scissors. A similarly awful fate awaits the pranksters Max and Moritz after we follow their rather nasty but funny pranks. At the end of the book, they're ground into feed and eaten by the miller's ducks, as you can see here. So I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see each other better. Whoops. How do I stop sharing? Let's see. So both of these books might have prepared me for the ways in which American comics in Jeremy's reading both represent and address kids. The naughty children, the humorous, often violent tricks they play on adults, the lively narrative, the ways in which these stories reflect cultural fears and desires and fantasies, a really important part of Jeremy's book. But when I came to the US at age 13, I found absolutely no appeal in comics, I'm sorry to confess. They surely would have helped me learn English and become American, as Jeremy makes so clear in his book. I would have learned and absorbed a great number of contemporary cultural preoccupations. But you see, I was really pretentious in my reading as a 13-year-old. I only read adult novels. I have to say Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks in German until I learned enough English to get, appropriate adult books out of the library. I looked at comics on the newsstands, but I have to say I was turned off by the gags. I couldn't get the humor. I couldn't get why they were violent. And I have to say I was also really turned off by the utter masculinity of these stories and images as a young girl. As an immigrant, a very European teen girl, I just couldn't relate to this. High school friends were reading Mad Magazine, and I consider it a failure right now not to have been patient enough to try to appreciate the layeredness and the complexity of its approach. So now you're going to wonder, what is this imposter doing on this screen? Well, I should have mentioned this earlier. I have taught comics and written about them, but I'm an expert on only a very small sample. As Jeremy said earlier, everyone knows one branch except for Tanir and Jeremy here and perhaps others of you. And all of this began when I read Art Spiegelman's Mouse, who's already made a cameo appearance in all of our comments so far, almost immediately when it came out. And as you can see here, I sort of live with a lot of Art Spiegelman's comics on my wall. And Mouse and Art Spiegelman really taught me about comics and how to read comics. And Tanira already talked about the packed suitcase, and that's one of many, many things I learned. I came to Mouse through my interest in the Holocaust, and indeed, this was life-changing in so many ways. Primarily, however, because comics offered Art Spiegelman, as a child of Holocaust survivors like myself, a form through which to express the complex relationship that the second generation had to a story we didn't ourselves live through, but which shaped our lives nevertheless. Like comics generally, Mouse challenges linear storytelling, it spatializes narrative, it offers economic forms that show and imply so much more than it says. It uses the gutters to say even more. So I first taught Mouse not in a course on the Holocaust or on comics or popular culture like Jeremy, but in introductory classes to literature, because precisely I wanted to expose students to different kinds of narrative and visual strategies, building on their childhood readings of comics. Art Spiegelman and I may be of the same generation of children of Holocaust survivors, but we have totally different relationships to comics. It's he who taught me about some of the history that Jeremy elucidates in this book, about the importance of Mad Magazine, of the Sunday strips that I had not read, of Robert Crumb and his quirky work, lots of on that in Jeremy's book, and especially the censorship of comics in the 1950s, to which Spiegelman devoted an opera. Maus spurred a keen interest in comic memoirs and novels, just as this genre was burgeoning. And I could not stop reading comics engagements with various painful histories in the work of Spiegelman, of Marjan Satrapi, Alison Bechdel, Chris Ware, David Small, Ross Chast, and most recently, my colleague Elizabeth Povinelli, and so many others that Jeremy mentions in his book. My modest foray into writing about a few of these works also enabled me to meet so many smart scholars, from which I learned so much. It's become an important subfield in literary studies, no longer included in what used to be called popular culture, but as Tania mentioned, there's a forum at the Modern Language Association with many, many wonderful panels. There are journals. I mean, it's become a field in its own right. And now American comics filled in so much of what I did not know. And I'm very grateful to you, Jeremy, for having done this amazing work. So I have to ask a couple of questions. And I guess I had a very different feeling from Tania. I really would have wanted some illustrations, some visuals here. It would have helped me. I'm a close reader by training and by temperament. So it was really hard for me to follow, not having myself the cultural background that I needed to appreciate the book. So I learned a lot about the industry, about the technologies, everything that's been mentioned so far, but I just wanted to see these strips. And then I was looking for a website where some of these might be held. I mean, I realized there are a lot, getting rights to things is difficult, but I also would like to hear what the thinking was in publishing the book in this particular form. I also want to hear more about gender. I mean, there's there's an index category for race. There's not, or racism. There's not an index category for sexism, and the way that these structures are developed in the book, there's a lot more that you do with race and racism. And then Jeremy, I mean, you've started telling us a little bit about your own story. You like superheroes, you taught a course, but I wanted to know more about your earlier reading life and your engagement with comics personally. You start the book with, how did we get here? But that isn't about you. That's about the, about the history of comics. So, I want to hear more about your personal story with comics. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, Tania. Rachel, now it's my turn to respond, right? I think to.
Yes, please respond however you see fit. And then at this point, I'll invite the audience to put any questions you have for Jeremy or the panelists in the Q&A.
Great. Well, I've been looking down because I've been taking sort of notes on both of these sort of wonderful and rich presentations and responses. I really am grateful to both of you for this, and I just want to make sure that I get a chance, at least somewhat, to sort of to talk a little bit about sort of the various questions and the various points that you guys both raised. I think I'll go in kind of the order that you guys gave them, and then maybe there will be some overlap that kind of also sort of transpires. I think that one of the things about writing, a history is that almost definitionally, I say this in the epilogue of the book, it doesn't really stop. And there are all sorts of things that you can really see that you are in the middle of. and you don't have necessarily the 2 feet sort of planted firmly to make kind of statements about. There's that famous quote to say that predictions are hard, especially about the future, and there's a way in which predicting the past is kind of difficult enough in that vein. I think that the digital, obviously, what I'm talking about here, among other things, is that digital thing. A couple of points, though, that I think I can make about this, exactly to sort of limn the tensions that Tanir is talking about. On the one hand, I think that there is no question that the shift to digital, the digital revolution and expansion has allowed for the possibility of diversity of representation, of creativity in a way that was literally impossible, not only for ideological reasons, but also for structural reasons. Literally, it was very near impossible if you wanted to get work in, let's call them mainstream comics, to do so for much of the history of the medium if you didn't live within a very narrow geographical area. That is obviously no longer the case. It is also the case that market-driven demands really allow for a certain kind of democratization that is, in some senses, although of course there are many different biases built in, but in some senses, much more open than ever before. If you produce art and 10 million people like it on Instagram, I don't know if those are the reasonable numbers for Instagram. I'm not on Instagram, but something like that. Yes, they are, right? The companies are going to notice this. And it doesn't matter who is drawing the pen. They are going to notice 10 million likes on this. And that opens certain doors, not all of them, not all the way, but it allows for certain kinds of possibilities. That said, as Tanir, I think you very rightly noted, many of these products of which allow for this diversity of possibility, whether it be kickstarted self-funded projects, whether it be Instagram, are controlled by giant corporate entities. And we've already seen the possibilities of either sort of explicit ideological censorship because of political concerns about content, or simply messing with the tech because of things. This happened on Comixology recently, messing with it for reasons having to do with update that then just sort of make things disappear, right? And both of those are kind of concerns that aren't necessary, that are outgrowths of other kinds of panics and sort of technological concerns, but they are newly kind of pervasive as a result of this. And that is still a story that we're trying to figure out. And that will change again and again and again, sort of as the decades go on, I'm sure. I think one of the things that we can say sort of as a prediction, I think about this a lot, that goes to your second point about audience. I often say this, that if someone had said to me as an 8-year-old, this gets a little bit to Mariana's autobiographical question as well. I know you're a big autobiography fan. But if you had said to 8-year-old me living in New Jersey, that you would be able to go to a public library and not just find the one copy of, let's say, Jules Pfeiffer's book with kind of a couple of comics in there, but a wall full of comics on every kind of dimension under the sun. And what's more, some of those things were in the library because we knew that they were going to be taught in parts of school curricula. I would have said, me, the 8-year-old, not you, but I would have been in heaven. This would have been utopia to me, right? And I think that kind of revolution, and we can and should talk about some of the retrograde and retrogressive sort of movements that are going on to censor and a certain kind of, right? But that kind of movement of saying this medium belongs in libraries and in public schools, that's not going to go away. I find that very, very difficult to believe. Particular titles, yes, lots of fights about particular titles. The medium, I don't think so. I think that has really sort of made its way in, thanks in no small part to people like Raina Telgemeier, but also to John Lewis. Also, despite sort of the narrative that's now raging about Art Spiegelman. Lots of different things have sort of moved this forward in a way that I find almost culturally irreversible. And I agree with you that part of that is leading to a kind of erosion between these categories of child and adult, in the same way that over the last 20 years, is something I didn't really talk so much about in the book because it wasn't quite on topic, but the development of YA as a kind of cultural category also sort of is eroding kind of these materials in a certain way. And I think that's important. I want to get to something that you both raised about images. And again, this question, I think, in certain ways, kind of manifests a lot of the institutional factors that we've been talking about. And I hope it's not telling tales out of school to go into some of the dirty business behind this. Part of publishing a book at this length is about price. And there were choices that were being made, which was to allow, or prayers, things like that, to allow images, right? Or to raise the price, to lower the price, to make the book a lot shorter. And I have to say that Norden, I want to just be very clear about this, Norden was very, very supportive of the decisions that I want to make. I'm not putting this on the public, right? But I said, perhaps wrongly, I think this is a possibility, that I wanted an extra X number more words and didn't want that pressure of cutting even more words to tell my story rather than have the images. Could be a mistake. Certainly some of the reviews on Amazon suggest so. But this really is one of the choices that had to be made. If we had this length plus images, it was, and I told myself, perhaps just telling myself what I wanted to hear, that because of the internet, if you wanted to find this panel, a picture of this, one could do it. Understanding in my heart of hearts that really that's not how any of us read books, but I was hoping that I could tell myself that. So that is, that is essentially the honest story behind this. But I want to really be clear: this was my decision and not Norden's. But it was a decision based on these kinds of factors, and it could have been a mistake. I do think that I do want to push back, however, on one thing, which is to say that Mariana was not an appropriate reader for this book. I want to push against that kind of strongly. There's an old Yiddish expression to the effect that a guest for a while sees a mile. And although I'm not sure whether Mariana, is a guest or not, she certainly sees very deeply into some of the important themes of the book. And I think, to some of your questions, Mariana, I do want to sort of illuminate them a little bit more here. One of them that I think you bring out with the example of Struwelpeter, which I think is very important, but did not seem, perhaps in my reading at the time, to have the same kind of impact on early comics that Max and Moritz did, is a thematic, hugely important thing, which is that sort of incorporation of horror and humor into comics. That real combination of this that really goes on. Most notably, I think, in these EC comics to create this moral panic in the 1950s, but all throughout. And these kind of modes, I think, are extremely important in thinking about kind of the history of comics, which allows also to remind me and us, that of another theme that was very important that I think Tanir sort of alluded to, which is that comics is really aware of its own kind of institutional history, as parody, as genealogy, as all of these kinds of things. So a lot of that is about a lot of horror is about the subversion of earlier material. I did not do the index myself, so I did not realize, in fact, that there was not that category. I know I'm getting a look from Ariana, but I do think that when I talk about gender in the book, and I think, again, maybe other people are better, that I talk about it a lot. One of the most prominent things about gender is about the explosion, let's say, of women's autobiographical comics in the 1960s, is precisely how it's framed in terms of a horrific subversion in comedy parodic form of earlier genealogies of comics. Aline Kaminsky Crum really starts out by saying, in some ways, I was raised on romance comics, and they sold me a bill of goods. Tanir is much more of an expert on this than I ever will be, but I think that there is that sense of all of that kind of thing coming in. Obviously, it's not surprising that the group of people who are thinking about this in these ways are people who decide to make comics, right? So naturally, they're kind of living and breathing comics as the medium through which they make their decisions. But that's obviously part of the history of writing a medium. The last thing I want to say, because I do want to open this up sort of more broadly, is to go back to this question of what Mariana also brought up as both Max and Moritz and Struwelpeter, as this question of moral panic about children. Think of the children, right? And one of the things that is so wonderful to me about writing a history is, Tanir mentioned the model of the circle, is how cyclical some of this stuff is. Right. There was a moral panic about comics in the first decade of the 20th century when comic strips become big. There's another one in the 1930s when comic books become big. There's another one in the 1950s. There's another one in the 1980s. We seem to be, at least to a certain extent, in another one now. These things happen. and we have to take them very seriously as they happen. And as historians, we are cultural historians, we also have to be aware that this happens a lot, and that there are that may provide us with certain information in doing it. There's more to say about sort of reading and other things like that, but I want to throw it back to you guys and to the questions that are coming out in our last 15 minutes.
Okay, I think this is time now when we go to the Q&A. And so we have a lot of good questions, although I'm going to take my prerogative as the moderator to ask my question before we go to the audience questions. But I also just want to offer my appreciation for the book again and our two respondents. That was really wonderful to listen to. And I love Mariana's images. I too, I think I am on her side. I noticed the lack of images, much as I enjoyed the words of the book. But that's actually my question, is that I'll just put it very simply. Why are comics so expensive today? Or maybe it's obvious why they're so expensive, but it is striking to me, given the history. You recount both the reputation and the genesis in the cheapest forms of printing, that today comics are almost prohibitively expensive. And so there's a question of access in that way, much as at the same time you're saying, we find the books everywhere.
Yeah. So it's a great question, and there certainly must be people better equipped to answer this than me. But I will give you some theories about it. One of the reasons that comics were so popular for a long time, this is going to be a weird way of getting to the answer, was that they were artificially cheap for a while. That they stayed at a price point that was actually much lower than they needed to be to break even. And then one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that comics cratered was when the prices were sort of suddenly jumped to take advantage of inflation. And inflation is a lot of the story, right? But other things I think I would say, comics are a kind of labor-intensive process, right? There's a lot of costs that can go in, and that accounts for some of the cost. Some of the cost also comes from the increasingly small audience, I think, for what we might call pamphlets or floppies or comic books. I'm talking about here in the mainstream kind of thing, right? As opposed to somebody who is publishing this stuff independently, right? That's a different kind of cost. So what's increasingly happened, I think, in many cases, is that certainly in the 21st century, there were a lot of comics that were selling in pamphlet form, at least, in numbers that would have gotten them, and these are the best-selling comic books that would have gotten canceled very easily 20 or 30 years before at these circulation numbers. And what that means is you have companies saying, well, we can charge these amounts that are higher and higher price points to people who are so committed to these books that they're going to pay. Their demand is fairly, there's an economics term that I'm not thinking of at the moment, but their demand is fairly inflexible for this. So they'll continue to pay, and everybody else just won't. And they will get this increasingly in other kinds of ways. Either they'll get it in a graphic novel form, right? And here I don't mean the graphic novel in the sense that sometimes we use this as an aesthetically ambitious thing, but a trade collection. Or they will get it on a kind of subscription service, increasingly like Comixology or Marvel Unlimited. And so you have these kind of possibilities to say, well, we're going to get around sort of paying the $3.99 or whatever it is for this 22-page comic book. And I have to say that, increasingly, I think that has, right now the circulation numbers actually seem to be okay. But if you asked me to take a bet within 20 or 30 years on the survival of the pamphlet form for the reasons that you're talking about, that I'm much less salient on than the future of the comic business, sort of more broadly speaking, which I'm very, very bullish on. So that's what I would say about that.
Okay, let me read some of the great questions from our audience, one of which is related to something you mentioned in your response, but I think you might have more to say about it. So this is from Sarah Cole, who congratulates you on the book. She says, as Tanir notes, the young adult realm has become a major field for these books. Based on my teenage daughter's extensive readings in the genre, I would say that they tend to attempt serious topics about race, gender, as Mariana says, national belonging, disability, and much else, following from the great precursor of Maus. Is this something you discuss in your book, and or do you have thoughts about why this genre has become so central in trying to tell these stories?
Yeah, I think sort of, Sarah, thank you for the congratulations. And I think it's a great question. And I think that one of the interesting tensions, I think both in YA and in comics in terms of this, is really on this word that we're all using, which is about, right? Which is to say, what are these works as sort of sustained kind of works? Are they only about sort of the exploration of a particular topic, which I know, Sarah, that's not what you're saying, right? Or how do they work themselves into a broader narrative in this way? And one of the interesting things about comics is that very frequently, and here I'm really talking at first, interestingly, about some of the most charged debates, which is around some of these corporate intellectual properties that have been around for 80 or 90 years, right, is a way of saying we are going to try and tell a much more diverse and wide variety of stories than have been told before. And in the process, the way in which we're going to shift those kind of stories and those perspectives is by incorporating either some of these questions or some of these different viewpoints. One of the, I think, most sort of interesting perspectives on this was when Willow Wilson really sort of took a kind of corporate property, Ms. Marvel, that had been around for a very, very long time, and in part was created simply so that nobody would steal the kind of trademark on Ms. Marvel, and turned it into a story of Kamala Khan, a young Muslim American woman who is going, right, and this is her landscape, right? This is her setting, right? Is this story about a kind of different perspective? Kind of, but also kind of not, right? And I think that has it been celebrated for incorporating that perspective? Yes, but I think that if it didn't deliver on the kind of superheroing action, it really would also fail in those terms. And so I think that this kind of genre has to do certain kinds of things, and I think that this is one of the reasons why so much of this YA material that is the most successful addresses this through certain kinds of very standard tropes, whether they be science fiction tropes, whether they be fantasy tropes. Here is the magical kingdom with these kind of twists that allow for the entrance of these wonderful stories. I think those are the ones that I think achieve the most purchase on the hearts of the thing. And this is not a new change, right? There's this wonderful sort of thing that goes around every 5 minutes on Twitter or other things that say, anyone who thinks comics are political now knows nothing about comics because they've always been political. Here we have comics have always been addressing this. It's just that often the exclusionary practices that they have been sort of seen as a kind of literally vanilla default. This is something that now we're sort of paying more mind to of the way in which that works. So I think that is very much the case with YA as well, using this to kind of incorporate that in the story. That's what I guess I'd say for now.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more. So this one is from our colleague Aubrey Gabal, who says, "Hi, Jeremy. I'm curious about the American specificity of this history. What parts of this history do you think are specific to the American context? What aspects of this history do you think arise in other historical contexts or on an international scale?"
Hi, Aubrey. First of all, a phenomenal colleague of ours who's doing sort of wonderful work on sort of the French graphic novels, French comics, all this material. So it's great to have you here. Aubrey, I think that, one of the things that was also interesting in my limiting sort of the storytelling, as you're saying, was, I was interested in these incredibly rich, and this gets back to something I alluded to with Mariana, incredibly rich international comic traditions as they impinged on the mindset of American comics makers. So, when Japanese the very sort of rich Japanese comics tradition comes to American shores, it comes in a very sort of strange way in which people are reading. They don't understand the words necessarily at first. You don't have English translations of this material. And so people are impacted in that a particular way. So in some ways, my facetious answer is all of the things that I say are specific to the American context. But of course, as you're alluding to, there are all sorts of meta and larger questions that are very much of this. I'll talk about only one here, which is that we haven't really talked that much about before, which is what I might call the genealogy of technique. And this is something that I try to address in the book in a kind of fun way, which is that so many of the things that are central to comics' very existence now, someone had to make them up. And you can sort of track them. One of my favorites is, that I talk about in the book is the development of something which we think of as so obvious, which is superheroes teaming up to fight crime, right? But you can actually pinpoint a time and a place, right, around 1939, 1940, basically, where people are like, hey, these two, let's put them together. And then everyone's like, oh, that's a good idea. We should keep doing that. Let's do that from now on. And so it continues, right? And certain other things kind of come together in that way. All of these cultural traditions have their own genealogies of these techniques, right? Sometimes with horizontal infusions from other kinds of cultural traditions, of course. And as the world gets smaller, thanks to the kinds of digital technologies that we're talking about, and sort of, right, we have a much greater sort of cross-pollination of this. But that kind of thing is sort of interesting, occurs in every sort of cultural context in its own way. And it's wonderful to read books that tell those stories. I do not have the qualifications like you do, Aubrey, to speak about them in non-American cultural contexts, but they're there from what I've read.
Okay, I'm going to ask you either one or two more, just depending on how the time goes. But I have, interestingly, there are two questions about Bradford Wright. So I'm going to read you from Asif Siddiqui and Harry Foster, and I'm going to read you Harry's question because his is more developed. Okay. He says, Comic Book Nation by Bradford Wright frames comic history in America in the context of youth culture and counterculture. In what ways does your book build on or differ from that perspective? Do you see it as a general history, or is there a theme that you're really looking to explore through a comic lens?
Yeah, I think it's a great guy. I think Bradford Wright's, and this would have been, and I think maybe Tenir mentioned it, right? But it would have been on that shelf that we would have sort of looked at circa sort of the mid 2000s, let's say. And I think a very good and very important book sort of from that period. I think that as Harry is saying, we do sort of very frequently see discourse around comics in terms of, is it for the kids? Is it a youth thing? What is it pushing back against? Is it very, and I think that there's a lot to be said for that on the one hand, that it really does sort of speak to the kinds of concerns that people claim to have at the time, right? So for example, in that first moral panic, all the way back in the beginning of the 20th century about the comic strips, people said, the kids love these comics. The kids are all about these comics. We're very concerned about this. And there are a couple of critics who sort of call everybody on this. And they say, you know what? You all say this. But the truth is, really a lot of adults are reading this too. Tons of adults all over the place. And very frequently, they say that it's about the kids, when really it's about a lot more than just the kids themselves. And one of the things that I was interested in looking at were kind of as much as I could think about finding them, were the kind of stories behind the stories. Sometimes statistics told some of those things, sometimes sort of small slips in sort of extensive interviews in places like the Comics Journal, right, where you would say, well, so just taking one example, if you look at the statistics of people who read comic books in the 1950s, right, people say 97% of kids. The numbers are actually in my book, so I might be a little off. You can look at it there. 97% of kids read these comics. Oh my God. But then you look at the numbers that go beyond that and you say, well, it's a drop off of half of the people stop reading comics when they stop being kids. Well, that means that 40-something% of adults are still reading comics regularly, right? And if you just flip around that story and you say, boy, this is a medium that half of the country is reading regularly. Let's say I'm off by a little bit in my numbers that I don't remember. Let's say it's a third, right? That's still a phenomenal number of adults who are reading comics. And it was an ideological desire to kind of vest this panic in the 50s as being about kids, right? And as a result, we begin to tell the story in an entirely different way. And I hope that I was able to put little landmines of kind of flipping around through the book to begin to sort of suggest at least alternate ways of thinking about the role that comics played in America, rather than simply youth or counter, although those are very important parts of the story.
So I want to say I'm going to end with one quick one that I think we can't leave behind, but there are several other really nice questions in the chat. So I hope these will be saved, and Jeremy, you'll have an opportunity to read and maybe respond to them. So I'm just going to end with this one. This is from Danny Fingeroth. Who would win in a battle, the Incredible Hulk or Mr. Natural?
So for those of you who don't know, the Incredible Hulk is a standard sort of Marvel Comics. Danny is having a good bit of fun here. Standard green skin. I don't like when I get angry. You won't like me when I get angry. Kind of a superhero with sort of ultimate gear. And Mr. Natural is kind of Robert Crumb's sort of typically ambivalent take on sort of the hippie kind of lifestyle, right? And so basically, I think what would happen would be the Hulk would kind of look at him. Mr. Natural would tell the Hulk to go take a long walk off a short pier, although in much more pungent language, and then the Hulk would pound him into the ground. So I think that's probably how it would end, with an orgiastic display of violence, which is not how we're going to end this panel right now on harmony and commensality. Thank you guys all very much for this. Thank you for the attention and the time and your time and attention. We really appreciate it all. Thank you very much.